The storm tore through the city like an angry beast, but in the heart of the chaos, a forgotten man heard a cry for help that would change both his life and the city forever. Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Let's dive in. A fierce wind howled through the empty streets, rain pouring down as if the sky had opened up in fury. It was the kind of storm that seemed alive, ripping trees from their roots and lashing anything in its path. A lonely figure shuffled through the storm, a tattered coat the only shield against the relentless weather. His name was Caleb, a man who had once had a life, a home, and a family, but now lived on the streets. His hair had started to gray, and his face bore the lines of years of hardship. Caleb was used to being invisible. To most, he was just another homeless man. Someone to walk past without a second glance. But this night, Caleb would not remain invisible for long. Caleb huddled under an old, worn-out blanket, sitting on the porch of a boarded-up building. He watched as the storm seemed to intensify. His mind wandered back to the days when he had a family, back when storms like this one meant sitting inside with his daughter, telling stories by candlelight. Those memories hurt now, but they were the only warmth he had left. Suddenly, a high-pitched scream pierced through the roaring wind. Caleb sat up straight, heart pounding. He knew that sound, a child's scream. Without thinking, he jumped to his feet, his eyes scanning the street. In the distance, through sheets of rain, he could barely make out a small figure stumbling near the edge of a flooded street. His breath caught in his throat. A child, alone in this storm? Panic surged through him. Caleb sprinted toward the figure, the rain soaking him to the bone. As he drew closer, he saw that the child, a boy no older than 8, was struggling to keep his balance as the water rose around him. The boy's face was twisted in terror, his small hands grasping at the air as if trying to find something to hold on to. He was only a few feet away from being swept into a large drain, the kind that could swallow anything in its path. "Hey!" Caleb shouted, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Hold on, kid! I'm coming!" With one final push, Caleb reached the boy just as the water surged. He grabbed the child by the arm, pulling him to safety just as the current tried to drag him away. The boy clung to Caleb's soaked coat, shivering uncontrollably, his face streaked with tears and rain. "You're okay now," Caleb said, his voice soft despite the chaos around them. "I've got you." The boy looked up at Caleb with wide, terrified eyes. "I want my dad," he whimpered. Caleb nodded, his heart aching at the boy's fear. "We'll find your dad, I promise. But first, we need to get out of this storm." With the boy in his arms, Caleb hurried through the streets, searching for any sign of shelter. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the cold was starting to bite into Caleb's bones. He finally spotted an old bus stop, its roof partially intact, offering some protection from the rain. He ducked under it and set the boy down gently. "What's your name, kid?" Caleb asked, kneeling down to look him in the eye. "Eli," the boy sniffled, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. "I was with my dad, but we got separated when the storm hit." Caleb frowned, trying to hide his worry. The storm had turned the streets into rivers, and finding the boy's father in this chaos would be nearly impossible. But he couldn't let Eli see his fear. He had to stay calm, for the boy's sake. "We'll find him, Eli," Caleb said, forcing a reassuring smile. "But right now, we need to stay warm." Caleb wrapped his thin blanket around Eli, shielding him from the wind as best he could. As the minutes dragged on, Caleb's mind raced, wondering who Eli's father might be. The boy was dressed in clothes that looked expensive, far too clean for someone who lived in the parts of the city Caleb knew so well. Whoever his father was, he wasn't someone who spent his days on the streets. Hours passed, and the storm finally began to ease. Caleb kept Eli close, telling him stories to keep his mind off the cold. But as the rain slowed, the sound of distant sirens grew louder, cutting through the night like a beacon. Help was coming. Within minutes, a group of people, emergency responders, drenched but determined, arrived at the scene. A tall, well-dressed man broke through the group, his face twisted in fear and desperation. "Eli!" the man shouted, his voice cracking. The boy's face lit up. "Dad!" he cried, scrambling out of Caleb's arms and running toward the man. Caleb stood frozen, his breath catching in his throat. He recognized the man instantly. It was Daniel, the city's mayor. Caleb had seen him on the news, heard his speeches about community and progress. But now, standing before him, Daniel looked like any other terrified father, his eyes filled with tears as he scooped his son into his arms. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still. Daniel held Eli close, his relief palpable. But then, his eyes met Caleb's, and the mayor's expression shifted from relief to shock. He took a step forward, still holding his son. You saved him," Daniel said. His voice barely a whisper. Caleb nodded, feeling awkward under the mayor's intense gaze. "He was in trouble. I couldn't just leave him." Daniel's eyes welled up, his gratitude evident. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could speak, one of the paramedics approached, urging him to take Eli to the ambulance for a checkup. The mayor hesitated for a moment, then turned back to Caleb. "Please, don't go anywhere," Daniel said firmly. "I owe you everything." Caleb stood there, watching as Daniel and Eli were led to safety. The world around him seemed to blur, the weight of the moment settling over him. He had spent so many years being overlooked, ignored by the world, and yet tonight he had saved the life of the most important person in the city. It didn't seem real. A few minutes later, Daniel returned, his face still pale, but his eyes filled with gratitude. He walked up to Caleb, his hands trembling. "I don't even know where to begin," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my son's life. I can't ever repay you for that." Caleb shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say. "I just did what anyone would do." "No." Daniel shook his head. "You did what most people wouldn't, and I want to help you. You don't have to live like this anymore." Caleb's heart skipped a beat. For so long, he had accepted his fate, believing that no one would ever care enough to help him. But now, here was the city's mayor offering him a chance to change his life. "I don't need anything," Caleb said quietly. "I'm just glad Eli's safe." Daniel looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "But if you ever change your mind, I'll be here. You've earned more than you'll ever know." As the mayor turned to leave, Caleb watched him go, a strange sense of peace settling over him. The storm had passed, both outside and within him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time he felt like maybe, just maybe, things could be different. And as the city began to wake up from the storm, Caleb disappeared into the night, his figure once again becoming part of the shadows. But this time, he walked with his head held high, knowing that for one night he had been seen. He had mattered. And that was enough. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.